Welcome back. Let's continue on with our example. We have Docker Compose all set up here, so we should be able to add Postgres on here as well, so that we just have everything running inside of a container. Now, before we do anything, and you might encounter some errors as well, always make sure that there's no containers running that might conflict. In our case, we have our SmartBrain API running. But just to start off from a clean slate, I like to do Docker Compose down, which will bring down all the services, as you can see over here. Perfect. Let's clear this. Now, in order to add Postgres on here, it's actually quite easy. We, once again, create a new service. And let's add a comment here just so we know what we're doing. So we'll say this is Postgres. And I'm going to remove this comment over here since we don't need it. Perfect. And I'm going to say that this is the backend API. Now within here, I'll call this service Postgres. It'll have a container name of Postgres. And we're going to use the image that is already pre-built for us on the Docker Hub. And the Postgres image on Docker Hub is conveniently called Postgres. Now, the other thing we want to do is, again, make sure that the ports are accessible to us. So we'll have our default Postgres, and this is just the default port for Postgres. You might remember that we've used this before whenever we've connected to our database, and we'll just forward that to the same port. Now, if I save this, let's see what happens when I run Docker Compose up, and then remember -- build to build everything. Oh, and you see that I've made a little typo here. It should be ports. Let's try that again. And you see over here how it's pulling Postgres, the latest from the library Postgres. You see that it's doing some work. And because this is our first time doing it, it'll take a bit of time just to download everything. Now, the error here, if you read it, it says that we cannot create a container service conflict. The container name Postgres is already in use. And this is something that you want to be careful of whenever you're using images. In our case, this image already has the container name set, so we actually don't need this. If I save this and run this again, look at that. Let's make this a little bit bigger so you can see. Actually, there you go. All right, looks like our Docker container, look at that, has Postgres and the backend. The backend is running, and the Postgres gives a lot of input here, but we see there's success. You can now start the database server. And if you keep going down, you see that Postgres init process complete, ready for startup. And then the final message is database system is ready to accept connections. Well, let's test these connections. Let's see if it actually works. If I go back to my pSQL and I try to connect to the SmartBrain, what did we call it in our server? We called it SmartBrain. I think we used 1, but let's just do SmartBrain because that's what we did. No password supplied. And I get password authentication failed for user Anagoe. Okay, that makes sense because I've created this database, but there's nothing that I've specified in here. And a more likely scenario is that there is a user and a password for a database, and we have a way to connect the backend to the Postgres. Even though they're in their own world, their own container, we want a way for them to speak to each other and connect securely. Now, the way we're going to do this is through environmental variables. So let me show you what that looks like. If I go back to Docker Compose, I'm going to give another property to backend API, and this is going to be environment. An environment is simply environmental variables that we're going to pass down. And within here, we can just simply do Postgres user will be, let's say, Sally. Postgres password will be, let's say it's a secret. And we'll say that Postgres database, let's call it Smart Brain Docker. And then finally, this is a bit of a trick, but if you see here, we have a host. And up to this point, host was local host. But remember, when we're running in Docker, it's in its own separate world. So we can't just reference local host from our computer. Instead, we are able to reference the name of the service as the host. In our case, it's going to be Postgres. And this is linked by adding a links property. And links simply says that in this Docker world of ours, I want you, the backend API, to link to Postgres. Let me show you what I mean. Going back to our diagram, we're trying to build this container out. We have our API server running, and we also have our database running now. However, they don't really know of each other's existence. They're not really connecting. And the API server needs to connect to the database to make all those SQL calls, like getting users, storing hashed passwords, and so on. And in the future videos, we're also going to have to connect Redis as well. So we're trying to form these connections. And once again, we're simply using links. In the future, when we have Redis as well, we'll have a Redis service, and it's going to be linking here in the links. So we have these environmental variables. Now, all we have to do is, if I save this and go back, I can simply access them through process.env.postgres. And let me just copy this because it'll be easier. The Postgres host, which is going to be Postgres. So there you go. Process.env. And we're going to do, for user, it's going to be user. Password, it's going to be password. And then finally, for the database name, we're just going to leave it at name. So let me just make sure the names are correct. User, password, DB, and host. So this should be DB. That's a weirdly named environmental variable, but that's fine for now. Let me save that. Now, we have to restart everything since we need to recreate our database. So the way we do that is, let me close this. I'm going to make this a little bit larger, clear the terminal, and run docker compose. And instead of up, we're going to bring everything down. And we see we have a bit of an error. If we go back to docker compose, we have to have a space in here. YAML files can get very, very tricky with spaces. Let's try that again. Perfect. And then run docker compose up again. All right, we're getting an error here saying that role Sally does not exist. If I go to my server.js and we just console.log process.env.postgres, let's say user, let's save. Okay, I get Sally. So we are getting these environmental variables. All right, let me minimize this. Here's the other thing. And I bring this up because we're going to always have these issues when you're first setting up Docker, and it can get really, really frustrating. But if we think about this critically, we've given our Postgres user and password, DB, host, all these information. However, we actually have not given that to the Postgres image. We need to also do the same thing to our database so that it creates the user, password, database, and has all this information that it needs. So if I copy this down here or let me copy the entire environments, variables, and I save, let me bring all this down again. We now don't have any of those issues. And by the way, I changed the username to lowercase just because that's standard. You don't want to have any uppercases in user field, but this just looks nicer. Now let's give this a try. If I click OK and say we want to connect to SmartBrain Docker, user is going to be Sally, password is going to be secret, hit connect. Look at that. We're connected to the database. Perfect. All right. Now, let's clean this up a bit. This is a little bit messy. And in most Docker Compose files, you'll see a bit of a different setup. Because from our SmartBrain API, we can simply connect to Postgres like this. I can just say psql Postgres and give my password and secret. So in my case, it's going to be Sally. Password is secret. Instead of localhost, remember, it's going to be Postgres, the port number, and our database. Again, because I'm using this from my laptop, which is localhost, I am exposing the port. So I could leave this as localhost. On the backend API server, when I actually connect to Postgres, I'll have to do this. In our case, though, since I'm doing this from my computer, from my local host, if I do localhost, I see that I'm connected. Perfect. Now, the setup that we want to do here is instead of having all of this, we're going to just say that there's a Postgres URI. And this URI will reference the Postgres. And very similar to what we did here. So I'm actually going to copy and paste this. Let's make this a little bit smaller. It's going to reference Postgres, Sally, secret. Instead of localhost, it's going to reference Postgres, port 5432, SmartBrain Docker. Now all I need to do is save this, go back to the server, and ignore all these things, and instead remove this, because we can simply do process.env.postgres URI for unique resource identifier. And if I save this, open up our terminal again, let's bring everything down and start it back up. We're now connected to that database and everything should be working. Very cool. We've just connected our two applications. Now it's time to see if this all works with our app. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.